Greetings. So today in the lecture we have talks about Rousseau and Hobbes. So I thought I'd do a little something on Marx and Mill as well to compensate at least a little bit. So this is a text by Richard Miller, who's an important commentator on Marx. This is from Stephen Cahn, our official reader, the big blue book, right? So let me again, the point is to read. This is a very important part of our course this year. So I'm basically going to read this aloud and maybe make a few comments. So let's go and let's see how it goes. So, but these texts are usually good, and to some extent give you a feel for what it's like to talk about these great philosophers briefly. Anyway, so Karl Marx, born in Trier in a Prussian province along the Rhine. His family was upper middle class. Yeah, it's kind of important, I think, to remember that Marx himself was really a bourgeois, in terms of class, maybe petty bourgeois, but still he was not working class really. Anyway, so he was nominally Protestant, ethnically Jewish, but really an atheist. But that's the point. From 1835 to from 1835 to 1841, he pursued his university studies, first at Bonn, then in Berlin, Hegel's university. His interest in law shifted to philosophy. So Marx became one of the young Hegelians who followed Hegel in viewing history as the rational development of the idea of freedom through the generation and resolution of contradiction, and much more than Hegel, criticized received traditions and institutions as obstacles to this progress. Okay, let's pause here. Let's pause here. So, history as the rational development of the idea of freedom through the generation and resolution of contradictions. And much more than Hegel, right? Much more than Hegel, criticized received traditions and institutions as obstacles to this progress. So important sentence, both for Marx and for Hegel. Anyway, although Marx earned a doctorate in philosophy in 1841, he turned to journalism as his most effective means of social criticism. So Marx becomes a journalist. But Prussian repression intervened. His newspaper was shut down, largely in response to Marx's investigation of poverty among the Rhinish peasantry. So let me just point out a couple of things. So when we talk about communism, right? Communism, the idea of communism back then and communism today, very clearly, when you look at repression, political imprisonment, censorship, shutting down of newspapers, but also of poverty, right? Marx is writing in a very, very different time. So when I say today that we are, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60% in communism, well, I would say at least 30% in communism, at least in advanced countries in the world. I mean this very seriously. And I think there are some very clear distinctions, including in the way that the economic base is organized between Marxist time and our own time, when we look at the advanced countries of the world. Now, of course, Marxists today we'll talk about them as, bourgeoisified, proletariat, right, and would point to new international division of labor, people like Wallerstein. But still, I think that communist society today is much less than just an abstract idea and much more something like a concrete reality. Anyway, so Marx moves to Paris. He combines journalism with intensive study of English economics, French political history, and the so-called communists, right? So in general, Engels very famously said that Marx is German classical idealism plus British political economy plus French socialism, the three components of Marxist thought. Anyway, so talking about communists talking about communal ownership and leveling of economic differences who had begun to attract a working class following in France and Germany. The source of our first selection is a rough draft known as the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. Yes, a very rough draft, not unpublished and unpublishable, and also difficult to make sense of if you are reading it without any kind of secondary literature, secondary commentary. Anyway, so first published in 1927, the manuscripts. So when we talk about Soviet communism, right? Look at this, colleagues. The Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, one of the seminal texts that we're reading in this course, is published in 1927, 10 years after the Russian Revolution. Anyway, so this again should remind us that we should not automatically assume that the ideas of the Russian Revolution are the ideas of Karl Marx. Anyway, So the manuscripts mark a large step away from the rationalist reformism of young Hegelians and have served since their publication as an epitome of Marx's abiding spiritual concerns. So it's going to be an important. Marx begins as a young Hegelian, as this reformist, revolutionary wing of the Hegelians, right? But he changes his direction later in life, basically becoming, whereas young Hegelians are quote unquote idealists and begin that believe that ideas are the most important vehicles of the progress of humanity, especially the idea of freedom, right? Later, Marx, or I should say not later, but already young Marx in 1844, right, is a materialist in the sense that freedom has objective material conditions. But in this sense, I have to remind everybody that Rousseau and Hegel and Marx in this course are very much first and foremost philosophers of freedom. Anyway, often Marx's project in these manuscripts is to use his experience and reading concerning economic life to transform certain diagnosis of psychological impoverishment that he had encountered in Hegel and in the atheist materialist philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. So again, Marx tries to go beyond Hegel and Feuerbach. Anyway, so both philosophers, both Hegel and Feuerbach, were concerned with the process of alienation, Entfremdung, in which, sometimes also Entäußerung, but I suppose Entfremdung here. Both philosophers were concerned with the process of alienation in which aspects of human life through which people could potentially express themselves or their common humanity are instead confronted as external phenomena opposed to self-expression. So we see the world as external, coercive, alien. The world does not feel as home, right? So Hegel and Feuerbach locate the roots of the self-estrangement in confused thinking, right? So for Hegel and Feuerbach, alienation is a question of mistake, cognitive mistake, an error in thought, right? The self's overly rigid conceptualization of its relation to objective reality in Hegel, or humans' conversion of species being, Gattungswesen, right? Our appreciation of our common humanity into awe at an imagined God embodying our common strivings, Feuerbach. So notice how Miller here very briefly explains what Gattungswesen is, so this difficult German word. In some very general, very simple terms, Gattungswesen is our appreciation of our common humanity, that I would say species being is the notion that human beings are essentially social. We become what we are through cooperation with others. That's the simplest way I can explain that, right? And for Feuerbach, the point is that human beings together are capable of doing things, but we project our power onto heavens. We alienate this power, and we imagine that human beings are sinful, and in fact it's God who's great. This is Feuerbach, right? But instead, there is no God. Humans make God. Humans collectively make God, and humans not individually, but collectively are powerful, have power to reshape reality. Alienation in Hegel is different technical. I'm not sure I want to talk about this quite right now. Anyway, Marx accepts the devastating effect of estrangement from oneself and others, but traces it to a specific feature of economic life under capitalism. So not a cognitive mistake, right, which would be idealist left Hegelian view, but for Marx, not the idealist Hegelian, but the materialist Marxist idea is that alienation is not due to a cognitive mistake, but it is due to a specific feature of economic life under capitalism, the necessity that wage earners face in selling their life activity as commodity in order to survive. So we have this free creative potential, but we are forced to wage slavery to sell our labor for a wage. Yes. So I would say that for Marx, alienation may be also due in part to a cognitive error, but the cognitive error is derivative. It is secondary to to certain objective estranging conditions, negative, deleterious conditions of material base. Anyway, unrestrained economic competition leads more and more people to lose control of means of production, forcing them to submit to the labor market. Again, submit to the labor market, coercive laws of competition market, right? So the cure for alienation is not just the removal of political restrictions, not just mere political emancipation, but also creation of a new kind of economy based on common control of production, common democratic, I would say, control of production. In the interest of reciprocity, expressive work, and satisfaction of needs, characteristic of cooperating human beings. So if you want higher needs, we can compare this to higher pleasures in Mill. So here I want to write the word democratic. And here where we talk about needs, characteristic of cooperating human beings. Let me write compared to Mill's high pleasures. Not the pleasures of enslaving one another, not making slaves of one another. You know, like the pleasures of command, the pleasures of humiliating or torturing another human being, but higher pleasures of, let's say, building a space telescope. Building particle accelerators or space telescopes. Colonizing Mars. Sorry, colonizing Mars, right? So notice colonizing Mars is something that human beings are capable of doing together. So there's an important element of necessary element of cooperation if people are to achieve things like colonizing Mars or colonizing the moon, or even building an international space station. Notice international space station, international cooperation. Anyway, so in 1845, the French government, under the pressure from the Prussian monarchy, expelled Marx. He moved to Brussels, began lifelong collaboration with Engels. So Engels, born to a wealthy family in Barmen. So Marx is petty bourgeois, but Engels is even more of a classical bourgeois. So he's a factory owner, right? And notice, right? So very characteristically, a conceptual decision, which I am prepared to defend. What Marx and what Engels do, they don't just give their wealth away. This is not going to solve the problem. Systematic problems require systematic solutions. They are doing something much more important. They're striving to understand the change that is going on. Now, this may sound idealistic in the sense that, it sounds as if, ideas of Marx and Engels are going to help reshape society. So in order for this not to sound idealistic, right, we have to say that the movement to communism is a real movement which is objectively rooted in the material conditions. And Marx and Engels just play a certain subordinate part in that, because ideas, the superstructure, evolves in the wake of the transformations of the base. The superstructure, as a rule, normally does not cause transformation of the base, I would say. And again, so when we talk about this, how in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, right, we have this new emerging mode of production, communism, which is already present in some form during capitalism, right? But then people have to become conscious of the conflict between communism and capitalism and fight it out. And Marx and Engels help that fight in their own way. Anyway, so Engels, so international textile manufacturing firm with a branch in Manchester. So Engels became part of the family business. So Engels was increasingly appalled by the conditions he encountered among factory workers. So again, horrible, dehumanizing working conditions. This was true of Britain in the 19th century, but this is very true of global capitalism in the 21st century, right? So we see some room for progress. In England, right now, the working conditions are much better than they used to be 150 years ago, right? But for the approximately 7 out of the 8 billion people alive on planet Earth, the working conditions are approximately the same. Anyway, which is, it's like there's clearly room for progress, but at the same time, clearly we have not made this progress uniformly for the mass majority of humanity. And this is the promise of communism. The promise of communism, but also the question and the challenge of communism, right? To see that our situation right now has this internal tension, internal contradiction within it, that the vast majority of people who work for capitalism, for the success of capitalism, right, do not actually benefit from the system, right? And maybe the situation can be continued, who knows for how long, based on ideological illusion, right? Ideological misrepresentation of reality, and also maybe through direct forceful oppression through physical violence. Yes, so maybe in this sense the situation can continue into the future, but it has this explosive character built within it. Capitalism carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And in his more optimistic moments, Marx thinks that capitalism is bound to destroy itself. But even if capitalism is not bound necessarily to destroy itself, still it has this problematic element. You know, it's dirty secret that, like, in the Hegelian sense, right, capitalism cannot be made transparent to itself completely. And even if it's going to exist indefinitely into the future, who knows? But even if you tried to imagine it, yeah, it would still perpetually have this systemic illness, systemic disease within it, right? That it hides this oppression, this coercion within it. Anyway, so Engels, experience of the appalling conditions of the working class, together with his reading in philosophy and political economy, led Engels through similar phases as young Marx, right? Culminating in this very important paper that Engels writes, The Condition of Working Class in England. Anyway, on their first quartered work, The German Ideology, which is a huge volume, unpublished, in their lifetime, again, published in 1932, again, way after the Russian Revolution, still, right? This is the source of the second reading here in Cahn. It's a difficult work, challenging work, but also very important work. In German Ideology, Marx and Engels lay out what they believe to be the idealist vision of history. Anyway, so as in the 1844 manuscripts, the project of the German Ideology is the economic explanation of spiritual ills, both alienation and one-sided personal development that Marx and Engels trace to the division of labor. So we talk about alienation, if you want, as a result of the division of labor. In many ways. So again, one way to look at this is under capitalism, we have this forced division of labor, and we imagine this idealized condition under communism where the division of labor will be voluntary. And under capitalism, differently abled people are forced to perform mundane, routine, dehumanizing work, whereas under communism, the idea is that human creative, individual and collective creative potential will be unchained and division of labor will be voluntary, and this will unchain and what's the right phrase? Allow the free expression of human creative potential, and this would increase both the well-being and the productivity of labor. That's the idea, at least. Anyway, a new theme is the explanation of how social systems develop in the German Ideology, right? In a vague outline that would be filled in and revised in much future work. Filled in and revised, right? So Marx's theory of history is given in outline in German Ideology, but in later texts it will be filled in but also revised. So you see, that's the problem with Marx. Okay, he writes something, but it's incomplete. It needs to be filled in. But also, Marx changes his mind later on. Anyway, and Marx is actually not equal to Engels, right? And Engels is going to have some ideas after Marx's death, which are not necessarily attributable to Marx himself, which is another problem. Anyway, Marx and Engels propose that the pursuit of enhanced powers of material production has the unintended consequence of creating new social relations of production, which in turn mold the political and cultural features of an era. So this is basically the base and superstructure model. Again, so this pursuit of enhanced powers of material production, which has the unintended consequences of creating new social relations of production. Again, this sounds very abstract. To make this concrete, we need to read Marx and to struggle to understand this, especially through particular examples. Anyway, along with this theoretical work, Marx and Engels were just getting to know working class radicals, especially members of the League of the Just, a conspiratorial communist group with branches throughout Western Europe. As they moved the League closer to their own views, as they moved the League closer. Well, anyway, so Marx and Engels eventually joined the League. In a congress in London, the League renamed itself the Communist League and adopted guiding principles that Marx and Engels were asked to elaborate in a manifesto. The result, Manifesto of the Communist Party, our next election, came off the presses in February 1848, the fateful year in the history of humanity, it seems to me. Just as the continental wave of revolutions began with the overthrow of the French monarchy. Now, I should mention, right, so the League of the Just and the Communist League, these people were not well known at all. So Marx, basically during his lifetime, was an absolute nobody. So Alan Ryan, I think, or somebody, jokes about how nobody was bothered by the publication of Das Kapital in Russian. Nobody cared. Marx was such a literal nobody that his works, weren't even censored. He was a small fish. In many ways, Marx was propelled to prominence by the revolution in Russia. And if a revolution in Russia had not happened, it's quite possible that Marx would have been one of those much less well-known figures, people like, maybe Simmel or Tönnies or Weber or Durkheim. Maybe slightly more impressive than the other ones, but much less well-known. That's, take what I said with a grain of salt, but that's a possibility. Actually, I should do take it with a grain of salt, because I'm not really an expert on this kind of history, social history of ideas in the sense. Anyway, go back a step. So the Communist Manifesto is an astounding mixture of advocacy, theorizing, and historical narration. It centers on a conception of capitalist society as based on an antagonistic relation. So this is very important. This antagonism at the center, at the heart of the capitalist mode of production, that will inevitably destroy it. So in the Communist Manifesto, it's very clear that capitalism will inevitably destroy itself. So we have, through this antagonistic relation between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Broadly speaking, the proletariat are those people who control no significant means of production and must make a living by selling the use of their labor power to others who do control the means of production. The bourgeoisie are these others, people exercising significant control over means of production and mainly deriving their income from the sale of what proletarians working these means produce. The two classes are two great hostile camps, since the competitive bourgeois drive for profits creates relentless pressure to reduce wages and to eliminate individualized ways of working that conflict with industrial routine. Again, so we have this coercive laws of competition in the market, which creates pressure to reduce wages. It's not because capitalists are evil, but market dynamics forces to reduce wages, right? And also to eliminate individualized ways of working. This is de-skilling, right? And there's a structural pressure for that. Anyway, Marx and Engels. So the wage becomes less, and the work becomes more and more dehumanized, not as a result of a conscious decision by the bourgeoisie, but as a result of market pressure. Anyway, Marx and Engels view political and cultural institutions, including the modern representative state, as advancing the long-term interest of the bourgeoisie in this conflict. Yet, in the face of this ruling class dominance, the bourgeoisie produces, above all, its own grave diggers. Again, so this is a very important idea in Marx, but also, I would say, a somewhat problematic idea in Marx, something that later Marxists would want to revise. Again, this simplistic view of the state as a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, as a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. This is going to sound a bit too simplistic to later Marxists. So yet, in the face of this ruling class dominance, the bourgeoisie produces above all its own grave diggers. Economic interdependence, the reduced importance of master craftsman expertise, mass literacy, and ease of communication are features of modern proletarian life due to the bourgeois drive to expand production. Yet, their utterly unintended result is the increased unity in resistance, resistance to the burdens of capitalist production, ultimately progressing to full-scale revolution and the creation of a proletarian ruling class. Marx and Engels see this as a basis for yet further transformation, ultimately including a stateless society in which work is motivated by desire for mutual benefit. So free, voluntary division of labor. Again, notice. So Marx and Engels are talking about how in the course of economic development, you get this reduced importance of master craftsman expertise, this mass literacy, ease of communication, right? And so the idea is that naturally all of these developments lead to increased unity in resistance, right? And you could ask, even in proletarianized countries like China, doesn't mass literacy, doesn't ease of communication, doesn't this lead to some greater idea of unity, to some redistribution of wealth and privileges from the ruling class to the working class? So I'm not saying that this settles the issue once and for all, but so like I'm not sure what I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure Marx and Engels are entirely right in their portrayal, but there's certainly something to it. I think they're capturing an important element of real life, if you want, by talking about how, on the one hand, right, capitalism reduces wages and makes work more dehumanizing, but on the other hand, capitalism, by providing basic education and means of communication, also enable the unity in resistance for the proletariat, right? Anyway, something you might want to think about. Anyway, responding to the revolutionary fervor that coincides with the appearance of the manifesto of the Communist Party, right? Marx and Engels returned to Germany. Marx as an organizer and main writer of a new revolutionary newspaper, Engels both as a journalist and as an officer in the Revolutionary Army. However, the revolutions failed, and Marx was exiled. It was Marx's final exile, never to return to Germany. He was expelled from Prussia in 1850 on account of dangerous tendencies, settling in London. Basically, England, the only place which would have him. Marx's family was desperately poor at the start. In fact, some of his children died of hunger, or at least died due to lack of resources to buy proper food and medication. And for the next 2 decades, after which Engels provided a stipend, Marx struggled to make ends meet as a freelance journalist, never kept him far from poverty. Most of Marx's theoretical work in the second half of his life was devoted to a description of the economic laws of motion of capitalism, which eventually took the form of his multi-volume treatise, Das Kapital, right? Only the first volume appeared during Marx's lifetime. So Das Kapital, in this sense, unfortunately, is largely unfinished. And as far as I can tell, the reason why it's largely unfinished is because Marx was depressed. Because, you know, the drafts were ready quite early on, but Marx just, it seems to me, as far as I can tell, was not motivated to finish them because he saw that the prospects for revolution are just far too bleak. Anyway, so the first volume appears in 1867. Marx's most important political activity in London was his leading role in the International Working Men's Association, the International, right? An international group of predominantly working class activists, which led demonstrations of English workers in favor of Irish independence. Again, very interesting. English workers in favor of Irish independence. You should read this: demonstration of Israeli workers in favor of Palestinian independence. Okay, let me even write this. So Israeli workers in favor of Palestinian independence. I think that's the kind of analogy we are looking for here. Anyway, so again, this idea of workers of the world unite, and nationalism is just a way for the bourgeoisie to divide and conquer, right? So Palestinian and Israeli nationalism is a way that the international bourgeoisie divides and conquers the proletariat. Anyway, okay, international strike support, outrage the respectable classes of Europe by supporting the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune, a revolutionary government, including members of the International, which controlled Paris for 2 months at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So Paris Commune, in many ways, is the most important prototype of communism for Marx, but also one has to understand it is a very sad and tragic experiment, in the sense that, you know, this is Paris under siege, so nothing really great could be expected to come from this, right? Because again, Paris is under siege by a professional Prussian army. There's no way that the communards in Paris can hold out. But still, it is for Marx, I think, very importantly, a proof of concept. Anyway, our next section is the celebrated preface to an otherwise little read work that is prefigured as part 1 of Das Kapital, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. So this is the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Super important, super obscure, but also super important work. Anyway, its fame rests on a paragraph in a brief autobiographical sketch, a few lines that contain Marx's most detailed statement of his general conception of social stability and social change. So basically, this is where we need to look. This is again, a precision of natural science, and also men must become conscious of the conflict and fight it out, right? Men produce their social existence under definite conditions, right? All this stuff, right? So this is the clearest expression of Marx's materialism, but it's not very clear, but it's the clearest. but it's not very clear. So this is a problem when we read Marx. Most of what we have in Marx are intimations, are drafts, are these vague ideas which are only later have been turned, some would say in a fairly haphazard fashion, into systematic account of Marxism. So what I'm saying is that, like, the scientific Marxism that people invented in the Soviet Union is mostly a creation of the Soviet Union, right? Marx was not a systematic Marxist in this sense. Anyway, yeah, with the help of other writings by Marx and of Marx's meaning here have become fairly well established. Well, maybe fairly well established. I would actually question that, how well established they are. In his analysis of capitalist society and manifesto, Marx takes the relations of control that dominate material production to be the foundation on which political and cultural institutions rest. In other words, the most important features of these superstructural institutions are as they are because this helps maintain the economic structure consisting of those relations of production. Despite these stabilizing institutions, Marx thinks that there are processes internal to some social systems that make change inevitable. Make change inevitable. The ultimate origin of such internal change lies in the mode of production. The ensemble of relations of control, work relations, and technological capacities through which material goods are produced. In particular, people's location in an initially stable economic structure may lead them to increase the productive capacity of resources they control until further productive improvement is inhibited by the old relations of production. So they become fetters. Relations of production become fetters on the forces of production. Anyway, Marx's paradigm is the inhibition of productive capitalist investment by guild rules, traditional overlord-tenant ties, and economically arbitrary grants of royal monopolies in late feudal England. So again, the idea that feudal relations of production, they fetter, they stifle, they hinder, inhibit, right, the new burgeoning capitalist mode of production. And so the idea is similar, that you have this burgeoning communist mode of production under capitalism, and it's being stifled, it's being fettered, held back by capitalist relations of production. In the same way that capitalism overthrows feudalism, in the same fashion, the idea is that communism is going to overthrow capitalism. Anyway, eventually, the enhanced productive forces, together with their fettering, provide resources and motivation for an effective social revolution so that the chains are broken and a new structure established, facilitating the growth of productive power. The development of Marx's theory of capitalism in his London years, which led to our last selection, was sustained by countless hours of reading in the British Museum Library. At the same time, the evolution of Marxist thinking reflected his personal contact with the British trade unionism. Trade unions are super important for Marx, while the manifesto had emphasized spontaneous tendencies of capitalism to dissolve division among workers based on ethnicity, religion, or nation. Tendencies of capitalism to dissolve. Are there these tendencies? Again, that's the whole point. Nationalism is a conscious, conscious or sometimes less than conscious strategy to not dissolve division among workers, to artificially create divisions among workers. Anyway, Marx came to see the antagonism between ethnically English and ethnically Irish workers as the secret of the impotence of the English working class. Again, think about this in terms of ethnically Israeli and ethnically Palestinian workers, or ethnically German and ethnically Syrian workers, or something like that, right? So, or ethnically Russian and ethnically Chinese workers. This is the secret of the impotence of the English class. Let me write the words divide and conquer. Divide and conquer, right? So, anyway, the division which is maintained by mass media of the time, requiring organized opposition by groups such as the International. So we have conscious propaganda, which has to be opposed by groups such as International. So again, workers must become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. This is place for genuine political organization, for genuine political struggle. Right? So this, you have this ideological misrepresentation on the part of mass media, and then you need to fight against it, Marx says, consciously. while the manifesto had described a downward trend of wages and working conditions of the to the threshold of bare physical survival. Again, this very important idea that due to crisis of overproduction, wages fall below subsistence, right? Marx became acutely aware of the sustained upward trend in real wages in Britain and benefits of the shortening of the working day. So this is basically concessions. So we have, again, we have the beginnings of Gramsci here, right? We have ideology plus concessions. This is the secret of capitalism. This is how capitalism fights against the communistic tendencies, right? And so when we talk about this conflict of which men must become conscious and fight it out, this is the conflict. The conflict is between exploitative capitalist system, which is propped up by mass media, ideology, and concessions on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, you have this burgeoning communist international movement. Anyway, so let's continue. Value, price, and profit, the basis for talks Marx gave in the General Council of the International, reflect this combination of theoretical work and concrete experience. The first 6 chapters omitted here argue against a position advanced in the Council's discussion that trade unions' activity could do nothing to improve the economic situation of the workers under capitalism. In our selection, Marx, in effect, gives a preview of aspects of Volume 1 of Das Kapital in order to shed light on the actual limits of capitalist labor market. For purposes of economic theorizing, Marx measures the value of a commodity by the total time needed to produce it, socially necessary labor time, both at the final stage and in the provision of equipment and raw materials, when the work is done with current techniques at typical intensity. So again, socially necessary labor time. Under average conditions, then, the value that a worker adds to what a firm owns in the course of a working day will be the length of this working day. But the value of the use of a worker's labor power for that time will be the labor time needed to provide for the worker's existence for a day, a smaller magnitude in any firm with a hope of surviving. A smaller magnitude in any firm with a hope of, anyway. Marx calls the difference between these magnitudes surplus value. He takes it to be the most important source of all these various forms of profit on capital, interest included, while the values of commodities are the basic determinants of prices, including the wage paid for labor. So again, so basically we have this exploitation. The worker produces value, but is paid only subsistence wage. The simplest way to understand this is, again, if you have the reserve army of the unemployed, the wages will tend to subsistence wages. Anyway, and also in the, I think already in the manuscript of 1844, Marx notes on how as labor productivity increases, in fact, the cost of subsistence goes down. So as the productivity of labor increases, the wages go down, because basically food becomes cheaper, right? So, and in relative terms, the power of the worker, the bargaining power of the worker also goes down, right? Wages go down, and again, this technology division of labor, conveyor belt production, right? Deskilling, workers are expendable. Technological progress creates unemployment. You can think about robotization in the 21st century. That's a whole another topic here I don't want to go into. Anyway, Marx's identification of the value of labor power with what is necessary to maintain and reproduce it suggests his earlier view that capitalism forces wages down to the minimum need for physical subsistence, again, subsistence wage. But in fact, Marx adds a further historical or social element. It too comprises necessities for workers, but this is because people's needs are themselves determined in part by their social conditions. Marx does think that reduction to the physical minimum is the tendency of things under capitalism. If workers only advance their interests as competing individuals in the labor market, they're bound to succumb to the superior bargaining power of capitalist employers. A superiority based, for example, on the desperation of a reserve army of unemployed, right, replenished by capitalists' recourse to labor-saving, capital-intensive innovations. So technological progress gives rise automatically to the reserve army of unemployed. But Marx insists workers can combine, can unionize, form trade unions, to resist the tendency of things through militant trade union struggles and forcing of favorable legislation, such as the 10 Hours Act. 10-hour working day. Today in Russia, we have 40-hour working week, less. Anyway, indeed, his judgment of the balance of forces in Das Kapital is that workers will succeed in cashing in a constant proportionate share of the gains from technological improvement when fluctuations in the business cycle are discounted. This gain in material possessions entail no increase in the value of labor power because value is a matter of labor time expended with current techniques, regardless of their productivity. Anyway, among the many questions about Marx's and Engels's meanings, some have proved especially apt to shed light on larger issues in political and social theory. The preface to Contribution to Critique of Political Economy, very important work again, seems to many readers to make technological innovation the ultimate source of change. Notice the word seems here, right? Technological innovation is the ultimate source of social change. But Marx's specific historical explanations, including the economic histories and capital, rarely give technology the leading role. Again, so this is important. Colleagues, you should write about this on the University of London exam, right? That if we read things such as the preface, it seems that technology is the ultimate source of social change. But if you read Marx's other writings, his historical explanations, including the economic histories in Das Kapital, Marx rarely gives technology the leading role. Is there an underlying theory that fits both general statements and concrete practice? In the manifesto and elsewhere, Marx and Engels seem to reject appeals to justice and even to morality as part of the radical rupture to traditional ideas. Again, so this is a question of whether Marx has a moral critique of capitalism, right? So Marx rejects this appeal to justice because justice is socially relative, socially defined. Justice is bourgeois justice, right? Again, students like to ask me why I don't like Kant. I don't like Kant because because Marx shows us the limitations of Kantian philosophy. Anyway, is there any sense in which the rejections are genuine? And if so, what replaces justice and morality? Marx and Engels treat politics and culture as superstructural, yet political goals and religious beliefs have obviously motivated conduct of socially important kinds. Can they admit that I suppose Marx and Engels admit that social processes are based on individual conduct that often has these motives without watering down their intriguing claims into banalities about the need to eat and the presence of economic and technological processes as some of the many important sources of change? So can Marx and Engels admit the individual conduct based on individual motivations, superstructural motivations, without watering down the materialist claims, right? It's a question, good question, right? Recent works exploring these questions include Jerry Cohen, Karl Marx's Theory of History, say hi, Defense of Technological Determinist Interpretation, this is Jerry Cohen. John Elster, maybe also we could look at that, Defends Methodological Individualist Reading of Marx. Alan Gilbert, Questions Economic Deterministic Understanding. Richard Miller, this is the author of this particular article that we are reading, Analyzing the Nature of the State, and from an anti-technological determinist perspective, history, right? And Alan Wood, again, wonderful book, very important for us, which includes the discussions of morality and alienation. Okay. And that's it. Okay. Slightly longer than I planned, but I hope this was useful. So, as always, colleagues, stay safe, take care, good luck, and I'll see you around.